Today I thought it'd be helpful to cover net unrealized appreciation. In particular, I thought today we'd cover what is net unrealized appreciation, how does it work, aka when are you eligible to use net unrealized appreciation, what are some of the tax consequences that go into using NUA, and then lastly some best practices to be aware of. So let's jump in. If you don't know who I am, my name's Chris Dime. I'm a certified financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. So net unrealized appreciation is a provision in the Internal Revenue Code section 402E4. This permits individuals essentially an option on how they want to pay taxes on the employer stock held within qualified plans. And those qualified plans could be things like 401ks, employer stock option plans. For today's video, I'm probably gonna refer mostly to 401ks because that's when I see NUA be the most impactful, but just know that there's more than just 401k application here. So typically inside of a 401k, if you don't employ net unrealized appreciation strategies, whenever you go to take money out of that 401k, you will pay ordinary income taxes. And specifically, I'm talking about the pre-tax portion of your 401k. NUA doesn't apply to any sort of Roth money you have. The IRS won't make a distinction at that point as to what distributions are from employer stock, what distributions are from, mutual funds that you might have inside the account. They're going to treat it all the same. NUA, on the other hand, allows you to break up employer stock and everything else in your retirement plan into two separate buckets. Now, this only applies to employer stock at the employer that has this qualified plan. You can have other stocks in there, but the NUA strategy will only be permitted on that native company's stock. When it comes time to action on net unrealized appreciation strategies, you'll take bucket 2, which was everything that's not your employer stock, and do a classic 401k to IRA rollover. Bucket 1, the company stock portion of your 401k, you'd move all that employer stock into a non-retirement or non-qualified investment account as an in-kind transfer. Now, when you move all your employer stock into a non-retirement investment account, you will owe ordinary income taxes on the basis of that stock. Just like you were taking a distribution out of your 401k, you'll pay ordinary income taxes at that time. Which, yes, of course, means that if you're under the age of 59 and a half or you don't qualify for a certain exception, you will pay 10% in penalty taxes on that basis of the stock that you withdrew. Whereas the appreciation, which is the fair market value of all the stock minus the basis, that appreciation, that's going to be considered long-term capital gains, and you can choose to sell that whenever you want. So theoretically, you could take the distribution out, pay your share of ordinary income taxes on the basis, and then not sell the employer stock for as long as you want to. Since it's in a non-retirement account, there's no required minimum distributions, there's no mandatory withdrawals, nothing. When you do decide to liquidate it, you'll pay long-term capital gains at that point, but you don't have to sell out of it, which is nice. Whereas everything that was moved to an IRA, you will have to pay required minimum distributions on that eventually. So why would you do this strategy? Why would you voluntarily pay ordinary income taxes ahead of time if you don't need the money necessarily? If the stock has appreciated high enough to where the price of admission, aka ordinary income taxes on the basis, is worth the tax differential between eventual ordinary income taxes versus eventual long-term capital gains taxes, then the juice is worth the squeeze and the NUA strategy is a smart move. However, if the stock really hasn't appreciated much and/or it's very high basis stock, it might not really be worth your time to do an NUA strategy because the tax saving might be de minimis. This is similar to the concept of doing like Roth conversions, where you voluntarily are paying ordinary income taxes on today's rates for ideally tax-free income in the future. Now, to clarify, none of the NUA stuff means anything is going to be tax-free in the future. I'm using that as an analogy that it might make sense to pay taxes voluntarily today, because when you forecast tax rates or you forecast where your income is going to be, it might make more sense to pay the taxes today so that in the future, tax rates are a little bit more in your favor. So when are you permitted to use net unrealized appreciation strategies? There are certain events that make you NUA eligible, which I would analogize to certain events that let you get into the NUA club. Number 1, if you reach the age of 59 and a half. Number 2, if you leave employment, but you're not self-employed. Number 3, if you become disabled and you are self-employed. And then number 4 is you die. If any of these are applicable to you, then you're in the NUA club. And yes, that does mean the NUA club has dead people in it. It's still an exclusive club. It just might not be the most exciting. Seriously though, if you do pass away, it's your heirs who are making the decision as to whether or not you will action on an NUA strategy. So once you've hit one of these qualifying events and you're in the NUA club, at any point you're allowed to execute an NUA strategy. You don't have to, and you might not choose to for a number of years. Nonetheless, you're in the club, you have the option now. And that eligibility will stay with you until you make any distributions or conversions. So specifically, these would be things like taking out a required minimum distribution, making an ad hoc withdrawal because you wanted some money out of this account, doing an in-plan Roth conversion, that counts as well. Or if you do like a partial rollover where you take a chunk and you do a tax-free rollover to an IRA. And then another one would be if you started taking out any sort of like 72T distributions where you're before the age of 59 and a half and you're going to take out substantially equal periodic payments. Those will all be considered distributions or conversions. If any of these events happen, essentially at that point, your clock starts to tick as to when your eligibility for using an NUA will run out. If any of these distributions or conversions happen, you have until the end of the calendar year to complete your NUA strategy. If you fail to complete the NUA strategy by the end of the calendar year, you'll be disqualified from using NUA. And whether you do or don't complete your strategy, the next year moving forward, you will be ineligible to do an NUA strategy again until your next NUA qualifying event, which again, going back to the qualifying events, turning age 59 and a half, leaving employment, if you're not self-employed, becoming disabled, if you are self-employed, and then dying. Of course, barring any supernatural intervention, if the first time you qualified was because you died, you're probably not going to qualify for dying again in the future. So what does right look like? How will you know when you've completed your NUA strategy successfully? AKA, what do you need to do before the timer runs out at the end of the year? Number one, the entire qualified plan must be completely empty. All your transfers, distributions, etc. need to be complete before the end of the calendar year. I understand that, some plans, like there will be onesie-twosie dividends and stuff that kick in subsequent years. That won't disqualify you from the strategy. Essentially, you need to do your best effort to make sure the account is entirely empty and closed. Number two, all the stock that you want to use for the NUA needs to have landed inside that non-retirement account. And number three, everything else has been moved to an IRA. To clarify, this all doesn't have to happen in one transaction each place. It could take 1,000 transactions, but nonetheless, it all has to be done before the end of the calendar year. So I probably wouldn't recommend doing more transactions than you need to get everything where it needs to go. So touching on taxation real quick, what are some of the big hit items you need to be aware of? To reiterate, the money that you're moving from your 401k that's rolling over to an IRA, that's not a taxable event. So you have nothing to worry about there. Now, eventually that will be ordinary income taxable when you do pull money out, or you're forced to with RMDs. But for this initial transaction, there's not going to be any taxes. There will be taxes, however, on the basis of that company stock you move into that non-retirement account. You will owe ordinary income taxes on that transaction immediately. And if you do this NUA strategy before 59 and a half and you don't qualify for any other exceptions like the rule of 55 or 72T distributions, you will pay an extra 10% in penalty taxes on the stock basis because it's a premature distribution. So even though you're doing a cool NUA strategy, that might turn the tables on whether this is a good move. When you do eventually decide to sell the net unrealized appreciation, aka the gain on that stock in the future, you'll owe long-term capital gains rates. The neat thing about that is you will not owe the 3.8% Medicare surtax on that. Federally, you'll owe whatever the long-term capital gains rates are for you, right? 0, 15, 20%. You will owe state income tax if applicable on that, but you just won't owe the 3.8 Medicare surtax. Another taxation piece to be aware of, if you decide that you don't want to sell all the stock immediately, which is probably in your best interest not to sell all the highly appreciated stock, any additional gain after the net unrealized appreciation moves have completed, that additional gain will either be taxed at short-term or long-term capital gains rates, depending on how long that gain has accumulated for. Which goes back to our standard, if the growth happened over less than a year, it'll be short-term capital gains. If the growth has taken place over longer than a year, then you'll owe long-term capital gains. The last thing I would say is that this net unrealized appreciation stuff does not qualify for the step-up in basis that currently exists under estate planning law. If I have $1 million of Microsoft stock and I die, my family gets a step up in basis on that $1 million to whoever inherits that money. Whereas if my $1 million of Microsoft stock was mostly net unrealized appreciation, The net unrealized appreciation portion will not get the step up in basis. So as we wrap up, what are some things to be aware of? Well, the first thing I would say is it's not an all or nothing deal. So if moving all of the employer stock into a non-retirement account and paying the ordinary income taxes on the basis is not in your best interest, you're allowed to move as much as you want. Maybe if the liquidity isn't there to pay all the ordinary income taxes on this move, you might choose to only move half of your employer stock and do NUA on half, and the rest can just go into that 401k to IRA rollover we talked about before. Keep in mind, once you do that, you lose net unrealized appreciation eligibility on that employer stock in the future because you moved it to an IRA. Another thing to be aware of is that these qualifying events reset one's eligibility. Let's say a qualifying event happened a few years ago. You left your employer, you didn't really know about these NUA strategies, and you took a distribution from that 401k for whatever reason. Since you took a distribution, right, that started that clock, and let's say since you didn't know about the clock ran out and you're out of the NUA club. Now, let's say you're retiring and you're retiring from a different employer, right? Because the first one you left, this one you're retiring from, that's a qualifying event. You're now able to do NUA. And the other cool thing to know is that one qualifying event can be used to apply to all of your retirement accounts. So let's say you had a qualifying event in your second employer and it's with Microsoft and you want to do some cool NUA strategy with Microsoft stock. You can use that same qualifying event of leaving employment to apply to your Boeing 401k that maybe you had a bunch of appreciated Boeing stock in. What I'm trying to say is that these qualifying events reset your eligibility. The good news is the clock only starts ticking once you've done a distribution or conversion. So theoretically, you could stay in the NUA club for as long as you want to, barring any distribution or conversion that happens. The last thing I would just add to this is you can use the NUA strategy to satisfy required minimum distributions. There's a 3-step process. Ed Slott writes about this online. So what are your calls to action? If you have highly appreciated company stock today, or you anticipate you will in the future, whether you're currently or not currently in the NUA club, start thinking ahead of time as to whether or not you want to employ an NUA. The last thing you want is for you to reactively do a 401k to IRA rollover because you're looking to consolidate things and miss out on the opportunity of executing NUA. Another call to action, whether you're an advisor like me or you're kind of a do-it-yourself planner, never do a 401k to IRA rollover without first examining the holdings inside that 401k. I would hate to see somebody miss out on an NUA strategy, especially if for whatever reason they're in a super low ordinary income tax year. I don't want them to miss out on the NUA strategy just because they're trying to consolidate things and make their life a little bit simpler. I'll link to some resources down below. Of course, I'll link the Internal Revenue Code's publication on this, which I'm sure you're dying to read. Other than that, have a great rest of your week. If you have more questions, drop them in the chat below, send me an email. We'll get you squared away. Have an awesome holiday season coming up. We'll talk to you later. Bye.